Oh, hello everybody. I'm Lukas Pairon. I'm founder and director of SIM. So good to see that so many of you are now out there online for the opening session of the fifth symposium. When the pandemic broke out last year, we first wanted to cancel the symposium, which had to take place at the Brussels Fine Arts Center, BOZAR, which is right behind me, last month in December 2020. But our friends of BOZAR did not agree. They insisted that we had to organize it, and if needed, in part online. You all know what followed. Several lockdown scenarios. We finally decided to organize our symposium entirely online. Thank you to the BOZAR team for making this all possible, really. Today is the opening session, during which you will see and hear the keynote speech by Geoffrey Baker. But I first want to give the floor to John Sloboda. John is our founding president, and he will tell you in a few words what the SIM research platform is all about. After Geoffrey Baker's keynote, Jeff and John will first have a discussion, exchange their ideas. And after that, I will be able to propose some of your questions to them. The Q&A will not be very long though, about 15 minutes, so I will surely not be able to introduce all your questions. Forgive me for this in advance, really. As you can read in the chat, your camera and audio have been muted and will continue to be muted throughout the session. If you have questions for the Q&A, please use the Q&A button down below your screen. And your questions will only be visible for the speakers and moderators, not for the other attendees. I will be back later on to tell you about the rest of the symposium program the coming weeks. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lukas. And may I add my welcome to everybody here from all over the world. It's delightful to see you, well, to know that you're all here. I have three pleasant duties today. The first is to say a few words about the SIM platform that is hosting this 9-session online symposium, of which this is number 1. And this is for the benefit of newcomers, but also to remind those of you who know us from previous events. The second duty is to announce, for those of you who don't know, a transition in the presidency of SIM, which will take place during this symposium. And the third, and most important, of course, is to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker and chair his session. But first of all, a couple of words about SIM. The SIM platform was officially inaugurated just over 3 years ago in conjunction with the second symposium held at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in summer 2017. I was the organizing host, so I know from first-hand experience what an enormous amount of work putting on a symposium is. And I didn't have to contend with a complete rethink of the structure due to an international emergency such as COVID-19. So I really would like to thank Lukas Pairon as organizer, the scientific committee, and our partners at the BOZAR Center for Fine Arts in Brussels for their creative adaptation to current circumstances. The silver lining is to open access to this symposium to a far larger online constituency than has been able to access previous events. SIM is the only body in the world that is solely focused on supporting and promoting research into the social impact of making music. Although its focus is research, it has always striven to be open and relevant to practitioners, the musicians who work with diverse constituencies around the world, because practitioners know better than anyone what research could be valuable to this growing field, and they are the ones who can most readily use research findings to enhance their practice. Our particular strength has been meetings, both large and small, a yearly symposium, and also a yearly residential intensive seminar focused on the needs of doctoral students. Our field will prosper to the extent that there are scholars and artists with doctorates who are equipped for the long term to build resilient and lasting programs of research and research training within higher education. SIM has been very fortunate from its outset in having the energies and vision of Lukas Pairon to steer us as our founding director. SIMM has also been equally fortunate to obtain generous funding support from the Belgian charities Fond Baillet Latour and Future 21 Foundation, as well as the UK-based Society for Education and Music Psychology Research, SIMM-PRE. And finally, SIMM has been fortunate to have a hugely active and committed international management board, 13 people from 8 countries, all passionate to make progress in strengthening our work, and led by a president. So this takes me to my second point. I've been proud and deeply honored to have been asked to be SIMM's founding president for its first 3 years. I'm equally proud to be able to announce a new president who takes office during this symposium, Professor Bridie Lee Bartlett. Bridie is head of Queensland Conservatorium Research Centre, Australia, and is a leader in SIMM research, both within her own projects, but also through the postdocs and the students she directs, and her editorial and public service duties. And on behalf of everyone, I offer my congratulations to Bridie. I know she will steer SIMM with outstanding skill and vision through its next years, which, like so much else in our world at this strange time, will probably be uniquely challenging. I'm remaining on SIMM's board, so I stand by to support her as she takes on this challenging role, a role which she is superbly qualified to fulfill. And so I move to my last formal and extremely pleasant duty as president, which is to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Geoff Baker. I first met Geoff at the very first symposium that Lukas Pairon organized in Ghent in 2015. The paper Geoff delivered there had me rushing to read his groundbreaking book, El Sistema, Orchestrating Venezuela's Youth, which has become an influential landmark for our field. Geoff has been a member of the music department at Royal Holloway University of London since 2005, where the focus of his work has been on music in Latin America, past and present. His wide-ranging activities include work on music in colonial Latin America, contemporary popular music in Cuba, and music and digitization in Argentina. His work has received wide recognition, including winning the American Musicological Society's Robert Stevenson Award in 2010, and being awarded the Leadership Fellow by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council from 2017 to 19. Not only is Geoff an internationally recognized scholar, he has been active in supporting and developing the wider field. From 2015 to 17, he was the director of the Institute for Musical Research, and from 2017, he has been a founding member of the management board of the SIMM platform, where his sharp perceptions have been invaluable in helping SIMM move forward productively. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Geoff to deliver his keynote address entitled Rethinking Social Action Through Music. Geoff, over to you.
Many thanks, John, for your introduction, and thank you, Lukas, for your kind invitation to speak today. Warm greetings to both of you and to all of you who are watching and listening today. My interest in the SIMM field dates back to the debut appearance of Gustavo Dudamel and the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra at the Proms in London in 2007. Inspired by the concert, I decided to study the phenomenon behind it, the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra program, El Sistema. This program needs little introduction in a forum like this. It's the largest and most famous SIMM organization in the world. It has been promoted massively in international media, which has depicted it as a miracle, rescuing hundreds of thousands of children from poverty and a life of crime. Programs inspired by El Sistema have sprung up in dozens of countries, giving rise to a field that I will be calling social action through music, which is one of El Sistema's slogans. A field centered in Latin America, but with a global reach, espousing a social objective and historically centered on the youth orchestra. The results of that research were published in my 2014 book, and in a number of articles since. In very brief summary, much of the publicly circulating information about El Sistema turned out to be questionable, including even the foundational claim that it is a program for social change. Most of the issues could be traced back to its founder, José Antonio Abreu. When the international media discovered Abreu in the 2000s, they likened him to Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Mother Teresa. But some Venezuelan journalists saw him quite differently, portraying a Machiavellian politician who was much more complex than the saintly figure of the global imagination. A 1990 investigation depicted him as a showman conducting the media with spectacular but illusory displays. The glowing international portrayals of the following decades serve as the perfect illustration. This conductor politician enchanted foreign journalists into disseminating his self-mythologizing story rather than interrogating what lay behind it. They overlooked the mixed reputation indicated by the article's subtitle, Abreu and his slush fund, which pointed to the odor of scandal and corruption that clung to him in Venezuela. Abreu had two ways of conducting the local media and cultural sector, the carrot of money and the stick of threats and persecution. This duality, giving with one hand, punishing with the other, saw him labeled the philanthropic ogre in a 1994 investigation. Abreu's political affiliations also raised numerous questions at home. During much of his career, he had close ties to controversial right-wing politicians, including former dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Yet around 2000, he performed a 180-degree turn to ally himself with autocrats at the opposite end of the political spectrum, and he again courted controversy by lending music students for the purposes of political propaganda. In my 2014 book, I concluded that El Sistema was far more complex than the miracle imagined by the global media. Since then, numerous other studies have appeared. In 2015, the Venezuelan musicologist Ludin Pedrosa explored how El Sistema and its supporters had created a mythical history of the organization. The former El Sistema violinist Luigi Mazzocchi, in conversation with researcher Larry Scripp, issued a strong call for total reform of El Sistema. The 22 appearances of the word fear in their report is surely a record for an article on music education. Ana Lucia Frega, a former president of ISME, unearthed two external evaluations of El Sistema from 1997 that expressed many criticisms of the program's approach and identified domination, humiliation, and harassment as characteristics of its pedagogical practice. The evaluators urged major changes, but the recommendations were ignored. In 2016, a special issue of Action, Criticism and Theory for Music Education saw a number of scholars offer ideological critiques of El Sistema programs, not only in Venezuela, but also in the US, England, Scotland, Costa Rica, and Sweden. Studies in other countries have questioned whether such programs really attract and retain participants from situations of extreme disadvantage and poverty, as media accounts and institutional publicity would have it. 2016 also saw the publication of a new evaluation of El Sistema, carried out by its funder, the Inter-American Development Bank, or IDB. It estimated the poverty rate among those who enrolled in El Sistema at 17%, while the poverty rate of the states in which they lived was 47%. In other words, the program seemed to exclude the poor rather than include them. The report concluded that El Sistema highlights the challenges of targeting interventions towards vulnerable groups of children in the context of a voluntary social program. 10 years earlier, the bank had loaned El Sistema $110 million to build 7 regional centers on the grounds that they would serve poor and excluded youths. Yet the centers were never built, and now the evaluation found the program did not effectively reach the poor either. Also, this randomized controlled trial found no evidence that El Sistema boosted cognitive or social skills, contrary to 2 decades of extravagant claims. The report's positive findings were both very slim and almost impossible to take seriously due to multiple methodological issues, as Mark Taylor argued in our joint article. Now, it's been very interesting to watch how this research has been received. Major institutions, musicians, and media figures around the world have turned a blind eye to the problems and continued to foster the mythical image of El Sistema. Take the IDB's evaluation. Music journalists ignored the results, even though El Sistema had been one of their favorite topics for a decade, and this was the largest study ever undertaken. They lived down to their colleague Igor Toroni-Lalik's depiction of the media as delivering the kind of unthinking whitewashing of El Sistema that is usually reserved for the Daily Mail's treatment of the Queen Mum. Major institutions spun the findings so hard that they ended up presenting El Sistema as a model of social inclusion for the world, even though the evaluation had actually presented evidence of systemic social exclusion. The story that was disseminated was the one that El Sistema's supporters had hoped to find, rather than the one that had actually been found. As Mark Rimmer puts it in the title of a recent article, El Sistema had become too big to fail. In the face of critical scrutiny, the initial reaction from El Sistema itself and its closest allies was total rejection. They did not acknowledge the existence of problems, much less commit to tackling them. But as the research and evidence accumulated, the response shifted to huge indifference and profound silence, as a colleague in Colombia put it recently. It's not just El Sistema and its supporters that have had little to say, though. Many in the wider fields of music education, practice and research have shrugged their shoulders as well. There's now ample evidence of corruption in the production of the public narrative around El Sistema. Yet, as we've seen recently in the political arena in countries like the US and the UK, many people seem unbothered by the corruption of information, just as long as they're hearing a message they want to hear. Most of this research has not been contested, much less disproven. It's simply been ignored. I call this phenomenon cul-de-sac musicology, in homage to Michel Audin's cul-de-sac epidemiology. Audin argues that some potentially significant research on epidemiology, despite being on topical issues and published in leading scholarly journals, is neither confirmed nor invalidated by further studies, but simply shunned by other researchers and the media because it's politically incorrect. In other words, the problem is not just out there in the practice world, it's also in here in the research field. Such indifference and silence is bizarre because El Sistema is a fascinating story for those interested in SIM and music education. Take its political aspects. It operates out of Venezuela's Office of the President. It has senior politicians on its board of directors. It's probably the prime example of the exercise of authoritarian political power through music education in the world today, and possibly one of the most striking ever. It's also politically ambiguous. Its model has been championed by both conservatives and progressives, but also subject to strong critiques from both left and right. There's clearly an awful lot to discuss and debate here, yet there's been considerable reluctance to talk seriously about El Sistema and politics. There are other pressing questions. El Sistema's official vision of rescuing children and young people from an empty, disorientated and deviant youth encapsulates a salvation narrative that's deeply grounded in colonialism and jars with contemporary thinking on culture and development. El Sistema's hermetic atmosphere and patriarchal dynamics were captured by Gisela Kozak-Rovero, who described it as a sort of male brotherhood of Knights Templar of classical music, with Abreu as the center of the cult. And yet, the political, philosophical, and ethical questions that such a picture raises are largely ignored in the public realm, and even in much research, in favor of simplified and exaggerated stories of social transformation. So it's not just that El Sistema is fascinating in itself, it's also a fascinating case study of the construction of knowledge and ignorance about SIM work. The largest and most famous SIM organization in the world is also the most questioned, and yet in the public realm, few people seem to care. What does this tell us about our field? For all the fascination of this topic, looking at this panorama a few years ago, it was hard not to feel disheartened as well. The evidence of practical problems and ideological questions was mounting, yet it also became clear that this was a topic about which it was difficult to have an honest, open, public discussion. The field of social action through music appeared largely unwilling to recognize the issues, and since the problems were publicly denied, there was little sign of proposals for dealing with them. Between the defensiveness, the indifference, and the silence, examples of self-critical reflection were thin on the ground. Above all, it seemed like practice and critical research were diametrically opposed, with little possibility of communication. A few years ago, the situation looked like an impasse. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the city of Medellin in Colombia was a hub for cocaine trafficking in the midst of a national conflict, and it was considered the murder capital of the world. In the 1990s, aiming to reverse the city's fortunes, the municipal and regional governments produced several strategic development plans that led to some striking policies for urban renewal. The city built cable cars and library parks designed by leading architects in some of the most deprived neighborhoods in the city. It also invested in the Red de Escuelas de Música de Medellín, founded in 1996. This network serves around 5,000 students in 27 music schools that have historically focused on orchestras and wind bands. Most of the schools were established in lower income neighborhoods in response to the problem of violence. The Red is defined as a social program with the aim of promoting peaceful coexistence. The city became world famous as an example of urban renewal and was labeled the Medellin Miracle. And the Red became known as the new image of Medellin to the world. In 2017 to 18, I spent a year doing fieldwork in Medellin. The results of this research will be published in March as an open access book under the same title as this talk. I found important similarities between the Red and El Sistema. The creator of the Red, Juan Guillermo Ocampo, contacted Abreu at the start, and during the first 7 years, Venezuelan teachers traveled regularly to Medellin to give intensive seminars. The Red was like an adopted son of El Sistema. So it won't surprise you to hear that the two programs shared many issues. For example, an internal report in 2006 concluded that a high percentage of advanced students showed arrogance, exclusion towards their peers, and a lack of respect towards teachers. This was a bombshell, considering that the program was funded by the city to promote coexistence. Furthermore, the Red had no strategies or activities aimed at addressing these problems. Like El Sistema, it just focused on intensive music making, which was supposed to resolve everything. Another internal document from 2012 contrasted the theory that music generates positive values and the reality of social divisions, rivalries, and negative attitudes that were found within the program. The Red also displayed issues found in other studies of social action through music in South America. For example, it is usually described as targeted at the poor and marginalized, yet it often does not reach this population, as we've already seen in the case of El Sistema. An evaluation of the Red in 2005 found that students came from slightly better off and more educated homes than average. Gabriela Wald's research on similar programs in Buenos Aires in Argentina revealed that the students who thrived came from more economically stable families. What's more, she found that these young people had an us versus them worldview, a clear sense of difference and distance from their problem peers. In other words, the programs did not transform the most vulnerable youth as much as they provided an outlet for relatively advantaged young people, exacerbating the distance between the two groups. So what was produced was not so much coexistence as social differentiation. In our respective cities, we found that successful music students were often socialized in the values of the program by their families prior to enrollment and received considerable family support during their studies. El Sistema's theory is that social change passes from the program to the child and then to the family and society at large. But there's more evidence for an opposite dynamic, that family values are the primary force shaping the child, and that music schools depend on those values and parental support to function properly. Instead of rescuing and transforming the most vulnerable, these programs rely on and reinforce the values of a fraction of the popular class with educational aspirations and committed to the education of their children. However, I'm intrigued by the differences as much as the similarities between the Red and El Sistema. While El Sistema was led by Abreu for 43 years, the Red was taken over by the city government in 2004 after its founder was jailed for money laundering. Hardly a great advertisement for social action through music. This period saw several key changes. The program was entrusted to the local University of Antioquia, the link with El Sistema was broken, and a psychosocial team was created. One of the first tasks of this new team was to conduct a detailed diagnosis of the program, and from that time on, it produced regular critical reports like the ones I've already mentioned. So if similar problems were identified in Colombia as in Venezuela, in the case of the RED, they were highlighted by employees of the program rather than by an external evaluator or researcher. And this meant that these problems were not rejected or ignored as in Venezuela, but rather taken seriously. The RED has undergone 5 changes of director since 1996. With each transition, there's been a process of self-critical reflection, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the program and implementing changes. Each time, the new director and the social team have argued that the RED is too focused on musical outcomes, and as a publicly funded social program, must take the social side more seriously. They've consistently urged the program to adopt a more participatory ethos, to provide more space for student voice, and to distance itself from dynamics of pity and charity that El Sistema established as the norm for this field. Another repeated critique has focused on a lack of musical and pedagogical diversity in the field's orthodox model. In short, if the two programs had similar problems, they've taken quite different paths. The RED has seen consistent attempts to tone down the intensive disciplinary culture of classical music that it inherited from El Sistema, which was seen as clashing with its social mission. The RED has been subject to far more scrutiny, debate, and reform than the Venezuelan version. I characterize the RED's path as a search, which started from recognition by its own leaders that the orthodox model of social action through music did not lead to the desired outcomes with respect to coexistence and citizenship. My year of fieldwork coincided with a period of intensified critical reflection and change. A new director, Juan Fernando Giraldo, and pedagogical coordinator, Luis Fernando Franco, had taken over in 2017, 6 months before I arrived, and their proposal focused on 2 related themes: identity and diversity. They criticized the RED's historical emphasis on classical formats and repertoire. Their response was to promote a greater amount of Colombian music and to focus more on its instruments and technical and stylistic aspects. They advocated for a horizontal relationship between Colombian music and the European symphonic tradition that had historically dominated the program. Most of the students and even many of their teachers were afraid of playing without written music. The new leaders, though, were composers, arrangers, and improvisers. Unsurprisingly then, boosting creativity was a central element of their new vision. Another critical focus was the need to create more spaces for reflection and participation. The students played in large ensembles, but historically they had played a minimal role in reflective and decision-making processes, so the degree of participation was limited. In 2018, the RED adopted a methodology of project-based learning. Each school and ensemble now develops a central project constructed in a participatory way between students and teachers. There are projects focused on local culture and history and on ecological issues. This approach is based on the idea that full participation requires much more than just playing music. In 2018, the social team was reconfigured as a territorial team. This decision was based on the diagnosis that many of the music schools had little or no connection to other cultural groups or organizations in their neighborhoods. They were like islands or bubbles in the city. The territorial team was intended to help schools to get to know the surrounding territory, to connect and collaborate with other cultural actors, and to listen more to the soundscapes of the barrios of Medellin. Change became an even bigger issue after I'd finished my fieldwork. 2020 saw the COVID-19 pandemic and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. Consequently, issues that I was researching went from being undercurrents in some parts of the field to major concerns in many. COVID put the spotlight on the centrality of large ensembles and the role of these programs in South America as a pipeline into the music profession. COVID turned large ensembles into a risk and a liability. Social action through music's central tool and principal selling point was rendered unusable in the short term, and question marks lingered over its medium-term future. The virus also put stress on the classical music profession, making it appear more challenging than ever. It raised further questions about programs that trained up larger numbers of young people from modest economic circumstances for this career. Black Lives Matter, meanwhile, gave greater prominence and urgency to questions of race, Eurocentrism and decolonization that had been swirling around music education, music studies, and the classical music sector for a few years. This question had also been lapping at the feet of social action through music, though it had been paid little attention. But El Sistema was created by a member of Venezuela's white elite, who privileged the performance of classical music by white European and European descended composers. His explicit ambition was to see poor Venezuelan children playing Mozart and Haydn, and his salvationist vision descended directly from the colonial period. As Black Lives Matter shone a spotlight on Eurocentric music education, particularly in the Americas, El Sistema looked uncomfortably like a paradigmatic example of white supremacy and colonialist thinking in music education. The Red was hit hard by COVID-19. Not only did it have to close, but also since its instruments were housed in the schools, many students were left without. Yet having already embarked on a path of pedagogical reform, it was well placed to respond. The prior shift to project-based learning turned out to have been a felicitous move. The Red's projects were always imagined as going beyond conventional collective instrumental performance. This meant that many interesting projects could be pursued throughout lockdowns and other restrictions in 2020. Students made instruments, danced, painted, researched, made radio programs and documentaries and so on. Some investigated the musical history of their neighborhood. In some ways, the Red seemed to be not just coping under COVID, but actually thriving. The crisis opened up possibilities that conventional face-to-face instrumental training tended to limit. There were more opportunities for listening to the voices of students and their families. Students and staff welcomed the new possibilities for narrating everyday realities through music. So the crisis appeared to have helped the Red schools to achieve the leadership's aims when it introduced PBL in 2018, developing reflexive projects in which students participated by thinking, talking, and listening, and not only playing or singing. Black Lives Matter had much less impact in Colombia than in countries like the US and the UK. But as with the pedagogical reforms, the Red had already started to engage with this issue several years earlier. Giraldo and Franco had placed diversity and identity at the heart of their reforms from 2017, and their commitment was not tokenistic. They not only championed Colombian musics and instruments, many of them of African and or indigenous origin, but they also performed such music themselves. So 2020 may have been a challenging year for Red, as for many music education programs, but its long-term commitment to change meant that it was well placed to cope with the major upheavals. And it saw them in positive terms, as potential catalysts for long-needed reforms. 2020 also saw the Red's 6th General Director, Vania Abreu Olaya, take over, and she is doubling down on her predecessor's efforts at reform. She publicly acknowledges the limitations of the classical music training that she herself received. She's embraced the idea of a quest for improvement, and she displays a willingness to listen to alternative perspectives, an openness to critique and self-critique, and a sense of humility about the Red's achievements and challenges. One of the most interesting aspects of my time in Medellin was that the Red's leadership welcomed me into the program. We developed a constructive and friendly relationship. I attended and even sometimes contributed to the weekly management meetings where major issues were thrashed out and decisions taken. I worked particularly closely with the social team. We developed artistic citizenship into a strategic priority for the program, and I was invited to make 2 presentations to Red on this topic. They even offered me a job as a consultant on artistic citizenship. This collaboration was beneficial to both parties. I helped the social team move citizenship education higher up the agenda within the Red, and they helped me by providing a triangulation point both on my fieldwork and on international scholarship on social action through music. The reason that I bring up my personal experiences is that they reflected general characteristics of the 2 programs that I studied. The rejection of critical research on El Sistema was not an isolated phenomenon. Abreu, the philanthropic ogre, was infamous for his intolerance of criticism. He put a lot of journalists on his payroll in order to ensure favourable coverage of his work. And if independent writers made critical comments in the press, Abreu would get them fired from their jobs, or he would counterattack. He surrounded himself by yes men and froze out people who questioned him. Critical evaluations were buried and their recommendations ignored. Abreu's idealistic discourse did not allow for doubt or self-criticism, and this attitude permeated El Sistema. So the response to critical scrutiny from 2014 was just one small chapter in a long history, one going back decades. In contrast, when I arrived in Medellin, the programme already had a 4-person social team in place, made up of social scientists and headed by an anthropologist. They were in the midst of researching the programme themselves. The previous head of the social team, a strong-willed psychologist, had spent a decade at the heart of the programme. So the RED had years of experience of researchers embedded within it, asking difficult questions, exposing uncomfortable issues. A space for critical reflection had become part of the programme. So again, my experience of being not just accepted but actively welcomed was one example of a wider ethos. A clear contrast therefore emerged, where El Sistema was notably closed to questions of self-critique, dialogue and change. The RED was much more open. In Medellin, the problems in social action through music were a topic of public discussion, and as it looked for solutions, the programme evolved noticeably over time. There was a willingness to accept and grapple with the ambiguity and complexity of this kind of work. If the history of El Sistema under Abreu was one of idealism, self-congratulation and pedagogical stasis, the RED's trajectory was one of repeated cycles of self-critique and change. The issues of self-critique and change have received little attention from researchers on social action through music. As a general rule, studies within this field have tended to be synchronic, to present programmes at a particular moment in time, and therefore as relatively static and consistent. But I take a diachronic approach and examine the changes and conflicts that the RED has undergone during its 2 decades and multiple changes of director. Also, critical studies have generally been articulated from the perspective of an external researcher, positioning critique and debate as primarily extrinsic to such programmes. But thanks to its multiple changes of leadership, the RED has been characterised by self-critique and sometimes heated internal debate. Some of the most critical opinions have come from within its own management team. So in my book, I prioritise the critical reflections of the RED's own staff and students. Looking at the RED questioned some conventional thinking within this field. Abreu's utopianism gave rise to a somewhat monolithic romantic view of social action through music as harmonious and unified. When critiques of El Sistema started to appear, so too did predictable and unproductive dichotomies of internal versus external, practice versus research, and advocacy versus critique. Yet the RED is made up of a set of different and at times opposing constituencies: management, school directors, teachers, students, parents, administrators, and social scientists, who articulate different and at times opposing perspectives. A critical dynamic appears as internal to the RED, not something alien or opposed to it, and debate takes place not between insiders and outsiders, advocates and critics, but between supporters of contrasting approaches within the programme. We see much more complex and productive dynamics at play than the simple battle lines of El Sistema debates. So why have these 2 programmes diverged when they began as close partners? Well, the RED experienced a dramatic rupture that never occurred in Venezuela. In 2005, after the founder of the RED was jailed and the programme taken over by the city government, it was opened up to full, independent, external scrutiny, something that the powerful Abreu always managed to avoid. Recognition that the RED had gone astray implied charting a new course. Crucially, the second director was not a protege of the first, as in El Sistema, but an external appointment by the programme's new operator, the University of Antioquia. The first thing that the new director did was to undertake a detailed critical study of the programme and produce a report laying out the problems and changes that needed to be made. Similar evaluations of El Sistema had been produced, as I've mentioned, but by external evaluators, and Abreu had sufficient political power just to ignore them. But in the RED, it was the director herself who produced the report, so its recommendations for change were central to her agenda, not something to be brushed off. The model of leadership is crucial. Abreu ran El Sistema for 43 years, and he was an infamously autocratic figure, as well as deeply conservative. In contrast, the Red is now on its 6th director in 23 years. The Red was obliged to break away from El Sistema's model of social action through music as a cult of personality around the founder. And this break opened up the possibility of self-critique and change. Also, as an old-school orchestral conductor, known in Venezuela simply as El Maestro, Abreu was firmly wedded to an autocratic model, both in the music training and in the running of the organization. But the Red's directors have included a sociologist, a dancer, and a jazz saxophonist, believers in the goal of social action through music, but not in Abreu's one-dimensional approach. Their diversity of experience and perspectives have given the Red's leadership a variety and flexibility that El Sistema's has distinctly lacked. The embedding of a social team at the heart of the program is another crucial factor. Again, the many social scientists who have passed through the Red since 2006 were all committed to its ultimate objective, but they were not romantics or true believers when it came to the power of music. They injected a healthy skepticism into the Red that El Sistema sorely lacked. They've helped to keep the cycle of self-critique and change in motion. Whereas Abreu had surrounded himself with yes-men, most of them trained in obedience within El Sistema's orchestral ranks, the Red's directors since 2005 have been accompanied by combative, no-nonsense social scientists. So change in the Red is directly related to a self-critical ethos that started with the leadership and fed off a constant dialogue and at times battle between social scientists and musicians. In the Red, critical research was incorporated into the program rather than excommunicated from it. We also need to look beyond leadership and consider other factors that operate above the Red. If the program embraced critical reflection from 2005, it was because the city government that funded it did the same. During my fieldwork, the Culture Ministry funded qualitative research in all the city's arts education networks. Also, the Red is not attached to professional music organisation, and it does not have a direct publicity or strategic role for the music sector. Rather, it's one facet of the cultural policy of the city of Medellin. And the city's cultural plan for 2011 to 2020 focused on democratic cultural citizenship, emphasizing participation, inclusion, diversity, creativity, and critical reflection. So there's nothing coming down from the funder about promoting classical music or the symphony orchestra. In fact, the city's policy pointed towards a very different approach to music education than the one that the Red inherited from El Sistema. In other words, the political and institutional context supported change. Studying these two contrasting examples shows that the relationship between practice and research is a crucial factor. Where that relationship is given space and support, the possibilities for positive change increase. Now, I'm not suggesting that this relationship will necessarily be harmonious. In Medellin, it was often quite conflictive, but that very tension is what makes it generative. In Medellin, I saw that collaboration between critical researchers and practitioners is possible when program leaders are committed to self-critique and change, and even more so when this ethos is shared by the funder or parent organization. There's a kind of virtuous circle here. If the key question becomes not how can we show off, but how can we work better, then collaboration with critical researchers makes more sense. Then a critical researcher may be seen as a potential ally rather than a stone in their shoe. Another point that emerges from comparison is that there are conservative and progressive tendencies even within social action through music, let alone within the broader SIMM field. There's a tendency to see socially oriented music programs as broadly part of the same family, just working with different tools and resources and on different scales. And at least in the global north, to see such programs as inherently progressive on the grounds of their social discourse. But in reality, there may be wildly diverging ideologies at play. Careful examination of their origins and politics reveal El Sistema and community music to be more like alter egos than siblings. For example, the ideology of personal deficit and correction that's central to El Sistema would be anathema to many community musicians. The variation within social action through music is not as great, but nonetheless, comparing the Red with El Sistema reveals that there may be significant political differences between programs that seem or started out quite similar. In fact, the Red shows that variation may exist even within a single institution. It was a hotbed of debate because it brought together a range of contrasting ideologies and practices under one roof. Such an internal divergence is missed in many accounts of this field. There are certainly many ambiguities and complexities in the story of the RED that I cannot share with you today for lack of time. For example, what are the implications of a music education program being framed as the new image of a city to the world? In other words, as a form of urban marketing. I explore such questions at length in the book. Today, though, my overriding message is that the case of the RED has shown that self-critique and change are possible in the social action through music field, even if they're not easy. That dialogue between practice and critical research is possible, even if it's not easy. And that there are routes for the field to move beyond the much questioned model of El Sistema. 2020 has revealed the advantages that such adaptation brings in a changing world. The RED continued on an upward trajectory despite, or perhaps even because of, the disruption provoked by COVID-19. As for my own trajectory, I started on a long downward curve in 2010 as I discovered both the problems of El Sistema and then the disinterest of the music sector in knowing about them. But the last few years have been an upward swing. There are signs of change not just in the RED, but also in some other social action through music programs. The impasse, the broken communication between critical research and practice, has given way to more spaces for dialogue and exchange. SIMM itself is a prime example. Strengthening the connection between practice and research is one of the priorities of the organisation and of events like this symposium. It's also the top priority for me. The experience of impasse with El Sistema, dialogue with the RED, and involvement with SIMM has led me to take up the role of Director of Research for a new music charity called Abreu, which is currently supporting practitioner researchers and funding pilot projects that are exploring research-practice connections. I think it would be very positive if our field saw not just more critical research, but also more spaces of engagement with practitioners, funders, and policymakers. This brings us up to the present day, and I'm going to finish with a 4-minute overview of the second half of my book, the forthcoming book, which goes beyond the case study of the RED and looks to the future of the field. In other words, I shift my focus from the rethinking of a specific program that was taking place in Medellin to a broader rethinking of social action through music. I consider how shifts in society and music education since El Sistema's foundation in 1975 raise questions about the field's orthodox model and how the search for alternatives has already begun in a number of social action through music programs. I suggest 5 areas as priorities for further attention and reform. Considering more deeply what the social in social action through music means and how musical practices relate to social goals. Taking greater account of decolonial thinking in music education and rethinking the approach to classical music. Treating social action through music as a political practice that requires political analysis. Placing citizenship education more centrally, which means more engagement with research on citizenship and the arts. And finally, looking more closely at demographics and targeting in order to focus more effectively on the top and bottom of the socio-economic spectrum rather than the middle, and to shift the balance from social reproduction to social change. I also explore challenges and obstacles to reform. These include limited circulation of knowledge and public debate, slow evolution of teacher training, resistance to change from within social action through music, and the conservative influence of El Sistema and some key funders. I also hold up 3 dilemmas of a more conceptual or philosophical kind, drawing on the work of 3 important figures in music education and SIMM research. Does music education constitute an effective and efficient means of tackling major social problems such as poverty and violence? Is social action through music inescapably rooted in colonialist ideology? And is this kind of music education inherently dangerous because of its susceptibility to appropriation by political or commercial interests? These questions interrogate the validity of social action through music as a concept. Finally, I focus on possibilities of transformation. I invite the reader to imagine what a future social action through music might look like. One that is Latin American, drawing on the region's musics, pedagogies, and epistemologies of music. Socially driven, starting from social goals and taking music of whatever kind as the means to achieve them. Emancipatory, not treating music education as a tool of social control, but rather seeking to liberate, seeing youth in terms of potential rather than deviancy. Realist, eschewing grandiosity and magical thinking, and instead naming and engaging with real problems via concrete interventions. And finally, sustainable, putting aside the industrial capitalist ideology of El Sistema with its focus on intensity, growth and mass production, and seeking instead to slow down and address the major social problem of the 21st century, the climate crisis. The challenges are great and numerous, and they feel particularly acute right now in many parts of the world. But the red demonstrates that positive change is possible. Also, we're at a historical juncture when progressive voices across many areas of human life are questioning whether we should rush back to an old normality that was already broken. If ever there were a moment to rethink the old model of social action through music, it would be now. Thank you for listening.
Geoff, thank you very much for an extraordinarily stimulating and wide-ranging address. And had we been together in the BOZAR auditorium, we would now be hearing and seeing the enthusiastic response from a packed hall. Sadly, you can't see or hear your audience today, but I know, and I know they would want me to say, that they have been in rapt attention, as I have, and that their engagement and appreciation will be manifest in the quality and quantity of questions which will start flowing in. So we now move to a 30-minute period of questions and discussion. The first 15 minutes, as Lukas already said, will be a dialogue between the two of us. And while that dialogue is happening, I do invite attendees who have questions and have not already written them to write their questions as succinctly as they can in the question and answer facility, which has been explained to everybody at the bottom right of your screen. So Geoff, while you and I are talking, Lukas Pairon will be sifting, organizing and prioritizing these questions so that you will be able to address at least a representative selection of those during the second 15 minutes. So dear attendees, please do start formulating and writing your questions. And I'm just going to set my clock running so that we stay to time on the first part of this session. So I'm just setting my stopwatch running now. Geoff, towards the end of your presentation, you invited us to imagine what a future social action through music might look like. One that you say has 5 characteristics: Latin American, socially driven, emancipatory, realist, and sustainable. Thinking of how we might apply this list to projects in other parts of the world, I can see that the last 4 characteristics are generic and easily translatable to other contexts. But there's a real dilemma in translating a term like Latin American to other contexts. So for example, if we were to take the country in which you and I both live and work, England, would it be satisfactory to suggest that a future SIMM landscape should be more English, drawing on the country's musics, pedagogies, and epistemologies? And if not, how should an English SIMM philosophy be framed?
Thanks, John. I think something to underline here is that I'm really talking about proposing not so much a national focus, really, as a regional one, a Latin American one, and also think about why I'm doing this. So there's in a sense there's a sort of cultural political angle to this, which is to do with questioning a prioritization of European knowledge in Latin America, which obviously has its roots in a historically unequal or colonial relationship between Europe and Latin America. So, it's a questioning of arts education that perpetuates this kind of historical relationship. And then also there's a what you might call a social action angle to this. So, asking what kinds of music are best suited to the social objectives that such programs aspire to. So, for example, if we're interested in social bonding, what kind of music foregrounds community, cooperation, that sort of thing. And if we're interested in addressing the climate crisis, what kind of music speaks to the relationship between human beings and the natural world, that sort of thing. So there's an argument, to say that Latin American musics may be better suited to some of these kinds of social objectives that are sought in Latin American social context than European music is. So I think this is an argument that could be extended to not just to Latin America, but other parts of the world that have had a colonial relationship to Europe. But I think that means that the situation in Europe is going to be quite different. For a start, the social action through music is already a European philosophy at its heart, so it doesn't really require nationalizing in that sense. And I think we need to be very cautious with that in a context like England, where right-wing nationalism is worryingly prevalent. So again, I'd be very cautious about advocating some sort of nationalist approach here. In fact, I think if we're going to take a cultural political approach, one could sort of turn my previous argument on its head and say, well, England's a former colonial power rather than a former colony, so perhaps we could question the hierarchization by exploring music from countries that were colonized by the British, learning about these cultures, about our history, about the variety of cultures that make up our country today. So, I think that, and the other thing would be perhaps thinking again the social action angle and thinking, well, what are the social issues, and what kinds of music and what sort of philosophies might be useful to bring in here, which might be from England, but it might be potentially be from anywhere. This maybe makes me think of a very interesting book by Victor Fung on Chinese philosophy and music education, and he applies principles from ancient Chinese philosophy, not Chinese music, but Chinese philosophy, to music education. And when I read this, it really kind of sparked off my thinking about imagining social action through music based on these kinds of principles. So I'm not at all against kind of translating ideas from one context to another. But it's more about sort of proposing more critical reflection about the political, social, cultural implications of the choices that are made, really, rather than a nationalistic approach. And also, I think, encouraging more experimentation. A lot of social action theme music still feels quite a lot like European or North American school music of the past. And I think that a field with such high social ambitions could really push for a more experimental, ambitious approach.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Because of time, I'm just going to press straight on to my next thought. Your comparison of the two programs leads you to conclude that there are conservative and progressive tendencies, even within social action through music, let alone within the broader SIMM field. Under the apparently unifying banner of social action, you tell us that there may be wildly diverging ideologies at play. It would be very good if you might be able to articulate in a bit more detail what it is that could identify a socially oriented music program as more or less progressive or conservative. Is this, for example, detectable from the publicly announced aims and objectives of an organization, or is it something more to be gleaned from detailed observation of what actually goes on the ground?
Yeah, I think, the answer is definitely going to be both. You can look at public-facing discourse and see, an emphasis in some cases more on social change, in other cases more on social reproduction. Social reproduction isn't always obvious. It's not called that, and indeed often it may be framed in language of social change or social injustice, so you need to kind of dig a bit deeper, even just on a discursive level, and see what's really going on. And there are clues one can see in the language. Are the problems and the solutions located within a level of the individual, in terms of sort of correcting the individual social mobility, or is there more focus on societal structures? Is the language one of deficits or assets? Is the rhetoric one of discipline and responsibility and respect, or is it one more of kind of agency and voice, creativity and so So I think there is quite a lot that can be gleaned at that level, but then this needs to be tested out by careful observation on the ground. So, how are these ideas appropriated or possibly resisted by staff, by students? Because obviously, I mean, there can be significant gaps between official discourses and what happens on the ground, particularly in big programs like these, where the distance between the top and the bottom can be very great and the numbers of people involved can be very large, and we can find significant variation even within a program between the funder, the leadership, the staff, the students, and maybe even from one teacher to the next. So ethnography is really important for sort of teasing out all these variations and differences. And I think what this means is that it's probably useful to think about these as tendencies within the field rather than necessarily labels that can be applied to programs from top to bottom, because we may find both tendencies within the same program, and they may be in tension, as they were in the case of the RED.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. You've told us that in 2018, the RED adopted a methodology of project-based learning. Some projects are focused on local culture and history and on ecological issues and so forth. And this approach is based on the idea that full participation requires much more than just playing music. So this new approach seems to require very significant changes, not least in the way that teachers behave, and could also suggest a more intensive use of staff time, all of which require new resources, as well as training and staff development, and possibly higher costs. So what you describe is actually a lesser role for direct music making and a greater role for music-connected work, such as research. So how has all this been managed within the RED?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, before COVID, certainly there had been a shift underway, but it wasn't a complete reversal. Large ensembles are still part of the program. They will always be part of the program, I think, working in a more participatory way, but still with a large ensemble model. That particularly at the level of the ensemble, the program-wide ensembles, at the level of the individual schools had been more of a shift, and this is partly because and they started surveying the students and their families in 2018 about what they wanted to do, what their interests were, what they wanted to play, sing, hear, and so on and so forth. And they found that there was quite a lot of interest in broadening the range of musical genres, so that it was more music that they knew, the kind of music they would hear on the radio, that kind of thing. But also that parents said, we want to hear our kids playing solos, we want to hear them playing duets, we want to hear them playing in small groups, so we can really distinguish their contribution, And the leadership was keen on smaller ensembles as well, because this is what's often found in popular and traditional music, which is what they were keen on, but also chamber music. And there are kind of musical and social advantages to smaller ensembles as well. So there was really a kind of diversification going on, rather than abandonment of large ensembles. It's kind of moving away from this bigger is better approach, really. And I think one way of thinking about this change would be to invoke Christopher Small's famous notion of musicking, which is this kind of broader conception of musical participation than just playing an instrument or singing, and seeing music making or musical participation as having many different facets, and music education as being much more than just learning technique and repertoire and so on. So then when we get to COVID, well, this shift obviously goes further because through necessity, and so we see more emphasis on these kind of other musicking activities. And there have been attempts to have Zoom choirs and Zoom orchestras like in other parts of the world, but I think the difference in the case of the RED is that the central focus has been on the project. And the realization there are many different ways to pursue the project, which don't involve necessarily large ensembles. So, rather than the sense of we need to get as close as possible to the large ensemble via Zoom, and we need to get back to it as soon as possible, there's been a sense of kind of, well, let's explore the alternatives and let's see them as more than just a poor substitute, And now, you asked me also about resources. Now, the RED has a fixed budget, and one of the challenges that it had was to try and do things differently without spending more. And the way that the leadership tried to do this was to try and delegate more from the senior staff and the directors to particularly the students and their families. So a kind of more of a co-constructive approach, which is positive in terms of participants, in terms of giving them voice, giving them agency, but also can be seen as taking some of the weight off the shoulders of the staff. So it's not like this is all falling on them to make all these changes happen, but actually delegate a lot of responsibility to the participants, that it's their project, that it's a public good, they co-own it, and they, you know, they ought to invest their time and effort into making it work.
Thanks, Jeff. And just as a quick follow-up, it would be really interesting, I think, to get more of a sense of how a process like that was actually managed, because on the face of it, if you have an orchestra of 60 people and you replace that with 10 projects or sub-projects, each with 6 people in, you'd imagine that each of those projects needs a teacher to kind of be with them. And so on the face of it, that looks like a huge increase in the resources. So I'm very interested what you say about co-ownership with the actual students and the parents and so on. That model, I think a lot of people would be very interested in hearing a lot more about in detail.
Mm.
But moving on, because time is not on our side, and I'm just checking how much, so yes, we've only got time for one more question. You've outlined some of the topics that the second half of your book explores, and this includes various challenges and obstacles to reform. And I'm particularly interested that you identify the slow evolution of teacher training as an obstacle to reform. Could you say more about what you observed regarding the training and formation of teachers in the El Sistema and the RED projects? And are there examples of exemplary training or development in other countries or projects that you know about?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I would say that the kind of, you know, the orthodox ethos historically in social action theme music has been that teachers don't need special training. The idea is that music making itself produces social benefits, so a skilled musician is necessarily a good social action theme music teacher. So what's characteristically found is a little bit of continuous professional development, a bit of CPD, but programs like El Sistema and the RED, staff aren't given any special training before they start teaching. Now, what was interesting during my time in Medellin was that the leadership was really starting to question this approach, and that the leadership were, you know, they felt that some of their own staff were underprepared for this kind of complex work. But on the other hand, you know, we're talking about resources. There was little they couldn't do. I mean, they didn't have the resources to provide a complete training. They had 150 staff, and they didn't have the resources to train these teachers themselves. So again, all they could really do was, you know, the odd CPD session. So, you know, standing back from that and seeing the field, I think that there are two kinds of approaches, which, I mean, my view is definitely partial. It's a huge field. I'm sure there's all sorts of things going on about that I don't know. But, you know, one is creating special training courses for this work. I know, for example, in the United States that some training programs have been launched specifically for this purpose, though I don't know what percentage of teachers who work in this field actually go through such training. My suspicion is still quite low. And the other is what was happening in Medellin, which was thinking about what was really needed was reform in conservatoire training writ large, you know, which certainly in Colombia, or in Medellin anyway, was still, you know, really quite conventional and quite focused on producing polished performers. So, you know, I think, you know, specific training programs are a step in the right direction, but, you know, reforms across conservatoire training, I think, is really, you know, is a better direction to point in many ways, although obviously, you know, extremely complicated. You're asking about, you know, are there specific examples? I mean, one that I encountered recently from outside this field actually was a study that's only just been published by a scholar called Felipe Zamorano, which is a study of music teacher training in a public university in Chile. And he describes the training of activism-oriented music teachers, which seems very appropriate to this field. And he talks about how teachers are formed as critical, reflexive subjects who are supposed to be focused on social transformation and not just technical training, and how they learn, they study subjects like you know, citizenship education and conflict resolution and so on and so forth. So, you know, they're really treated, they're encouraged to see their work as political. They're encouraged to get involved in political, you know, movements, mobilizations, and they're encouraged to question their own training, you know, to question the norms that they were trained by, and if necessary, turn these upside down. So, you know, I think this is very suggestive as a pointer to what this kind of training might look like in future. And it's, I mean, it's certainly an area I think is absolutely vital to the future development of this field. And it's an area that I'm very interested in. And in fact, in Agrigento, the charity that I work for, we're, one of our grantees runs a Sistema program and is also doing a PhD in music education. And she's designing and delivering a university module for training teachers that really digs into the complexities of this kind of work.
Thank you, Geoff, and that's very personally interesting to me. I am in my institution there as a doctoral student working on progressive curricula in conservatoires around the world, and I think would be very interested to dialogue with you further on that. But we are completely out of time, so I'm now going to pass over to Lukas, who is going to help open up the discussion to the floor by selecting and reading out some of the questions, the many questions that have now appeared in the Q&A box. By my estimation, 32 already. So Lukas, you have a hard job ahead of you to select the 5 or 6 that we can actually deal with. Over to you.
Well, pretty impossible job, especially when you said that that you expect me to give the most representative questions. It's quite impossible. And the questions are really, there's so many interesting questions and remarks. So I need to pick out some, and I'm sorry really for all the other questions. And we will think of how we can also provide these questions to all the attendees later on after this session, because it's the questions themselves are interesting to reflect upon, not only to answer now in this talk, in this session. But I would like to start with several questions are about the social impact. What is the social impact? What is the possible social impact of such music programs? And Annemone van Zijl, she asks it in this way. She asks Geoff to really give your personal opinion on whether social action through music could tackle major problems like poverty and violence, and so maybe let's start with this question, and it's a question which comes back in different ways. Ignacio Priego, Francesca Marco Sendon, and Andre Felipe, they also are interested in finding out more from you, Geoff, on this question of the social impact.
Yes, I mean, getting right to the heart of the matter, to the trickiest question, and I mean, I think that one way of thinking about it is different levels of social action. So, you know, I think the closer, this is my perspective, just my perspective, but I think the closer one gets to kind of the level of the individual, of identity of individuals' everyday lives, the more convinced I am about claims about social impact. And the further one gets away from those, the more one comes across broad sweeping statements about having a dramatic impact on violence, on poverty, on criminality, on major social issues like that, I become increasingly less convinced. And certainly the evidence becomes much more hazy for those larger claims. I mean, I think, you know, in terms of what I believe is possible, I think that in a sense, the more modest claims, the more believable they become, and the more realistic they are, in a sense, as goals. I mean, something that I very, very briefly alluded to, and I talk about a little bit more in the book, is that I think if one is going to shoot for the big goals like violence and poverty, then one really needs to think very deeply about how these problems are produced, and not just what the effect of these problems are. And I think one of the problems with social action through music is that its efforts are focused pretty much 100% on assuaging the effects rather than tackling the causes, because they only focus on one half of the picture, and that's the half of the picture of, if you like, the disadvantaged, the poor, the vulnerable, and so on and so forth. And there's no attention whatsoever to the advantaged, the privileged, the people with the power, the people who have the power to pull, who hold the levers of power, and who have the potential to make the kinds of social changes that would affect the social structures that produce these societal problems like like poverty and violence. So I think if one were really serious about addressing these kinds of problems, one might want to completely rethink social action through music to focus on the powerful rather than the powerless. I can't hear you, so I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you.
Lukas, you're not audible.
Yes, I saw. Sorry. It had to happen to me. And so another series of questions are concern what you discussed as on the repertoire, the excellence, and Luc Nijs is asking something very specifically in that context, and he asks you, Geoffrey, could you elaborate on the possible role of movement, and also the place that improvisation can play in. Let me see. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the use and benefit of improvisation to stimulate social action through music? Is improvisation a way to bypass the repertoire issue?
Yes, I mean, I think the improvisation was an issue that was of great interest to the Red's leadership when I was doing my fieldwork. They were improvisers themselves. They are improvisers themselves. The leader is a jazz saxophonist. He's no longer the leader. So there was a lot of interest in this, and I think that this was read both in musical terms and giving people more musical flexibility, but also in social terms, in terms of giving people kind of greater flexibility, if you like, in their lives, and even in cognitive terms. I mean, this wasn't discussed within the program, but there are scientific studies about the positive effects, cognitive effects of musical improvisation. So I think there are very good reasons for focusing on improvisation. There are studies of the positive impact of improvisation on social inclusion. So I think it's a very fruitful area. It's an area which has been historically sidelined in social action through music. It's starting to be taken more seriously in the last few years. It's something that was always completely alien to the original ethos of this field with El Sistema and the reproduction of these great works of the European canon. But I think this is a direction that is really sort of beginning to take hold now. What the big practical problem is, a lot of people who teach in such programs are not confident improvisers themselves. And so this was something that I took part in the Red. Was I went along to CPD sessions with other music teachers where we were learning to improvise, and I'm a very poor improviser myself, so I suffered along with the rest of them. But it was quite clear that there were some teachers who had more experience of popular or traditional music who were quite confident, and there were a lot who had a classical training who were really uncomfortable with it. And the challenge was how to persuade these teachers not just to learn to improvise, but then to teach improvisation.
Several questions are also about what the role can be of researchers in helping practitioners, musicians, and social workers to come to a better understanding of how things can work. And people want to also know your opinion about this. And you already mentioned it several times during your keynote. But maybe it's interesting to come back on this specifically. Yeah,
I mean, I think that there's, it's an area that I think is really important to explore. I think it's really important for SIMM and for all of us to explore, and it's something that I want to explore a lot more in future. I kind of feel I've only got partway down doing so, but I think that it's really worth a kind of future project in a sense for myself is to really think about this idea of a research practice divide. and thinking, well, what's really behind this? And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to turn it into something concrete, but rather think about different fields of human activity. This isn't something that's unique to SIMM or to music education or to music making. It's something that's found across all sorts of human activities, is issues of translation between research and practice. And I think that there may be interesting things that we can learn by looking at other fields and seeing how these kinds of issues have been addressed. In our field, I mean, I think there are pragmatic issues around translating research in terms of research that's either very inaccessible, it's behind paywalls, or it's in extremely expensive books, or the volume is too big. We have these wonderful big handbooks by Oxford, social justice in music education, or community music, but who other than researchers really has the time to sit down and read these things? I mean, I wish people could, and I highly recommend it because they're extremely illuminating. But
it's great that your book will be in open access, really.
Well, that's one help, but there's still there's a volume of information, sometimes a complexity of information, and issues of access. So I think more understanding of what these barriers actually are, and I think as much as anything, what I've discovered in Medellin was it's a question of will. When there's a will, there's a way. When people want to collaborate, when they want to learn, when they have this shared question of how can we do this work better, then these kinds of collaborations just spring up. They happen organically because people are really after the same. The people are searching for the same goal in a way.
In this presentation, you remind us of your very critical research and findings on the Venezuelan Sistema, and then introduce us to the Medellin project. A series of questions of people are about the projects, other projects, Sistema-inspired projects, and not only in Europe, but also in other Latin American countries like Chile and Brazil. And can you didn't study these other projects, but I'm sure you have remarks about it. And
yes, I mean, I think a very interesting question, and one that I would really open up to listeners, to participants in this event, to tell me, because my vision is extremely partial. I've studied 2 programs in great depth, but this is a vast international field, and I only know a tiny little bit of it. So yes, I mean, there are programs that have caught my attention, and there are programs that I've visited. I have a sense of movement in some areas of interesting questions being asked, interesting changes being made. But also I have a sense of stasis and conservatism in other areas. But trying to kind of map this is very complicated. But in Latin America, to name one example, a couple of years ago I visited Neo Jiva in Salvador, in Brazil, and had very interesting few days there, and saw various kinds of shifts, and had above all had very interesting conversations with members of staff there, which were illuminating. And there's a very interesting project in Argentina called Andrés Chazarreta, which is focused on Latin American music, so trying to kind of really based on a critique of the Eurocentrism of El Sistema, so trying to use the same kind of model, but very, very Latin Americanist in ethos, and more political, really. I mean, and there are more examples that I could give that I give in my book, and there are many, many more that I'm sure are out there. And I would love, if this talk and my book were an invitation for people, those of you who are listening, to tell me, to tell each other, to tell the world about good things that are going on, interesting movement that's happening, good changes that are going on. So to turn this into a bit more of a movement for change in a way.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, John, for being with us. And really, we will now finish this session, this first session, and Jeff, I think. A lot of what you mentioned that you introduced us to will come back in the coming 8 sessions of the symposium for sure. Thank you for your precious contribution, and I think it will surely interest many attendees to come back with us the coming Tuesdays for the symposium program. In fact, next week, Anne de Bishop will share a session on what motivates musicians to engage themselves as practitioners in social and community music projects, what they expect from this work, their experiences doing it, and their needs in terms of training and accompaniment. You could find all the details on next week's and all other sessions on the websites of SIMM and of BOZAR also. The sessions will each time last for, like today, about an hour and a half. They will start with presentations, short presentations of research, followed by a panel discussion and with those who just presented their research. And then there will be also again a time for a Q&A, allowing you to be active as well. We hope to be able to also propose at the end of each session some music performed by participants in the Belgian social and community music projects. The pandemic is not making it easy, though, to guarantee this for each and every session. You can, in advance of the upcoming program, also listen to our podcast with interviews with those chairing the panel's discussions. The podcast can easily be found online because many different directories propose it now. I look forward to see or hear or read you these coming weeks and wish you, in name of our team, a wonderful, healthy, and safe new year. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.